you all.
Yes, exactly. This is true.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Rabia.
Hello.
Hi. Hello.
I was just, oh,
Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, Rabia, we did a webinar together like a long time ago, I think soon after, right, very soon after the pandemic began. And I remember thinking, gee, it was a really long time ago. And we've been doing this, or at least here, we've been doing this work from home thing for so long. Back then, I didn't think we'd be meeting again so much later in the same situation. Anyway, good to see you again.
Yeah, same here. Same here. We've been also doing a lot of webinars, but the university opened, so we've been having on-campus classes. So yeah, it's been a big mix of both.
Indeed.
Rabia, that's a really nice background. It's like you're
Yeah.
sitting in the mountains.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm at home, but yeah, so I've chosen this background to be. I wanted to go to the university, but it was just so late and dark winters, that I decided, okay, let's do it from home.
So you mean that's not your real view there?
No,
It look
no.
It looks very real, by the way. That's the whole
it
thing. It
does,
looks
yes.
so real.
Yeah, I've been told, I've been asked, where are you? So I say, okay, I'm up in the mountains somewhere. So, but you guys know the real story. I'm in Lahore and suffocating here. So, pretty bad situation with the air quality.
I drove to Lahore yesterday from Islamabad, and the thick smog right at the entrance of the motorway. I was like, I just want to turn around the car and go back.
Just started.
Is Tamanna here?
Don't see her.
So what's the format, Hussein? How is this going to go?
Zishan, could you please give the details on the format?
Yeah, sure, sir. Absolutely. So, ma'am, we have a 2+2 format. So basically, we have 2 speakers from the US and 2 speakers from Pakistan, and both of them have different themes that they will be deliberating on. Our speakers from the US will be deliberating on what impact the US elections could have on the US policy options towards Pakistan. And then our Pakistani speakers, which include Dr. Hussain and yourself, will be deliberating on what impact US elections could have on the policy options for Pakistan. So basically, that's what we'll be achieving today. And as far as Ms. Manna is concerned, she is just about to join us. I think we can start on time and she'll join us later if that's okay with the speakers.
I think we should wait for 5 more minutes.
Sure, sir.
Michael, quick question.
Yes.
Since I'm not there in the US right now during the elections, how much should we trust the polls right now?
Yeah, right. That's the question that everyone is asking, right? No, I mean, we saw what happened in 2016.
Are we into some sort of surprises?
What's that?
Are we into some sort of last minute surprise like the last time?
Who knows? Anything is possible, basically. I mean, the way things are these days. But there's a professor at American University here in DC, and he's correctly predicted every presidential election since I think 1984, and he's weighed in with his prediction for this one. Yeah, so that someone like that I would trust over the polls. Alan Lichtman is his name.
I think Tamanna is also here. I think we can start now.
Hi, how is everybody?
All good, thank you, Tamanna, for joining.
Very good, thank you.
Ambassador Chaudhary, good to see you online as well.
Zishan, we can start now if you're ready.
Sure, sir. Assalamu alaikum and good morning to our speakers from the US and a very good evening to our speakers and participants from Pakistan. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's jointly organized webinar by the Islamabad Policy Research Institute and the Wilson Center, Washington, D.C. The subject for today's webinar, ladies and gentlemen, is Trump versus Biden, the future of Pak-US relations. The webinar is a 2+2 format, which means we have two speakers from the US and two speakers from Pakistan who will be sharing their thoughts on the subject. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now briefly introduce the speakers. Our first speaker is Mr. Michael Kugelman. Mr. Kugelman is the Deputy Director of the Asia Program and the Senior Associate for the South Asia at the Wilson Center. He is a leading specialist on Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan, and has written extensively on the subject of Pakistan youth, India's energy security, and transboundary water management in South Asia. Our second speaker is Ms. Tamanna Salikuddin. Ms. Salikuddin is the Director for South Asia Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she oversees USIP's work in Pakistan and the South Asian region. She comes into this role with extensive regional expertise in Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and Sri Lanka, particularly in the political and demographic trends in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Rabia Akhtar is our third speaker of the day, and Dr. Akhtar is the Director of Center for Security, Strategy, and Policy Research, and also heads the School of Integrated Social Sciences at the University of Lahore. She is a member of the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on Foreign Affairs, and she has also written a book titled The Blind Eye, U.S. Non-Proliferation Policy Towards Pakistan, From Ford to Clinton. The fourth speaker for today's webinar is Dr. Hussain Nadeem. Dr. Nadeem is the Executive Director Communication Reforms at the Islamabad Policy Research Institute. Before joining IPRI, Dr. Hussain Nadeem was the CEO of the Nerve Center, a data analytics and digital media firm based out of Lahore. He also previously worked at the United States Institute of Peace, the Wilson Center, and recently the South Asia Study Group at the University of Sydney, Australia. I would like to thank all of our participants for joining us. Before we commence with the proceedings, ladies and gentlemen, I request all participants to please keep sending in the questions to the host account on Zoom. Please mention your name and designation followed by your question. The relevant questions will be asked at the end of the presentation by the speakers. I would also request all our speakers to please kindly mute themselves and so as not to disturb with the proceedings of the webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now request our acting president, IPRI, Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, for the welcome. Over to you, sir.
Hello.
Yes, sir, you're completely audible, sir. Please go ahead.
Am I audible? Okay. Okay.
Yes,
Thanks, Zishan. And
no problem, sir.
I welcome all the distinguished participants in this joint Wilson IPRI seminar. Before we start with the formal proceedings, a word about Islamabad Policy Research Institute. The institute has recently started itself, and hello. There's a bit of a discussion.
Sir, I would just like to stop you for just 1 second. We need to sort out some technical issues. Obviously, somebody does not like us talking about the Pakistan-US relations. Let me just sort this out. We'll sort this out with us for a few seconds. Thank you. Apologies for the inconvenience. Ladies and gentlemen, just especially for our speakers, just a short announcement. Because of some technical issues, we will be assuming control of the microphones and the videos, and we'll be affording that privilege to the speakers. So apologies for that. Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, I'm sorry for the disturbance. Please, sir, you may continue with your welcome address.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're perfectly audible. Please, sir.
Okay, so once again, a very warm welcome to all the distinguished participants in this joint seminar. Islamabad Policy Research Institute has recently embarked upon a set of reforms wherein it is being reoriented into a new direction, and we are looking at extensive collaboration both within the country and at international level with the think tanks like Wilson, so as to expand our research horizons. The new research philosophy of Islamabad Policy Research Institute is premised upon actionable policy input and a better nexus with the policy making hubs and with the National Security Advisor and Special Assistant to Prime Minister, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, as our ex officio patron. We have a better visibility of the policy landscape, and henceforth our research products will get more visibility with the policy making hubs. And the areas that we are concentrating upon are strategic studies, international relations, lawfare, economy, public policy, and governance. And we are also looking at joint events and joint research by way of exchange of scholars and establishment of special chairs on subjects of research which are relevant and germane to the policy landscape of the country. Now, coming over to the subject, the new elections in United States, these promise a lot of policy shifts, and Pakistan is looking with a lot of interest at the proceedings. Joe Biden and Trump are locked in one of the most charged political campaigns in American history. The outcome of the presidential elections is being predicted through exit polls and projections, and all that predicts a close run outcome, with Biden leading in most of the states. The swing states are going to be the most crucial factor in the final outcome. On this vote depends whether America would aspire to be a city on the hill or a pale variant of Monroe Doctrine. Upon this election hangs the fate of the new policy architecture that gives hopes to the immigrants in the United States, the dispossessed in the economic black holes of the world, and the climate hopefuls struggling to save the planet. For Pakistan, the election has implications for regional peace, especially in Afghanistan, and the prospects of an economic alliance, in contrast to geopolitical alliance of the past. So with these few words, I leave the turf open for the learned speakers to enlighten us on the subject. So over to you, Zishan.
Thank you very much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, as described earlier, the discussion is divided into two sub-themes. The first sub-theme is what impact the US election could have on the US policy option towards Pakistan. Our respected speakers from the US would like to deliberate us on this, and I would like to invite Mr. Kugelman for his deliberations on the theme. Over to you, sir. I'll shortly be unmuting you.
Yes, hello, I assume everyone can hear me. Thank you very much. It's great to be participating in this event with IPRI. I also want to acknowledge my friend and former colleague, Hussein Nadeem, for his leadership at IPRI. Hussein, I think, as was mentioned before, was a colleague at the Wilson Center some years back, where he spent some time with us as a fellow. It's great to be reunited with him here today, and it's great to have our respective institutions hosting this event. My bottom line assessment of today's topic is that we really should not overstate the impact of the US election on US-Pakistan relations. The US-Pakistan relationship, I think, will be shaped more by the evolving geopolitics of South Asia than by who wins the election. And that is because at the end of the day, President Trump and a potential President Biden would generally see Pakistan and the US-Pakistan relationship in similar ways. And that, I think, is the case for their thinking on South Asia on the whole as well. There's not much that these two men agree on, for sure, but policy in Pakistan and the broader region is an area where they do see eye to eye. Speaking in very broad terms, both Trump and Biden would view Pakistan as a country that is very much worth engaging and that merits a workable relationship with the US, but also a country that represents a complicated and often difficult partner. Both Trump and Biden, when he was vice president, experienced both good and bad times with Pakistan. For Trump, as I think everyone will remember, things got off to a pretty bad start with the Trump administration's South Asia strategy announcement in August 2017 that certainly was not kind to Pakistan. That was followed by the infamous "No More Lies and Deceit" tweet from President Trump, and then aid to Pakistan was suspended. But then the US-Pakistan relationship rebounded in a big way once the US decided to pursue talks, or once it got serious about deciding to pursue talks with the Taliban in Afghanistan, and the president directly sought and received Pakistan's assistance. This led to Imran Khan's visit to the White House in the summer of 2019 and to several positive meetings between President Trump and Prime Minister Khan. By contrast, while Trump's experience with Pakistan went from bad to better, I think in the case of Biden, when he was vice president, it went from good to not very good. Early in the Obama years, there was the establishment of a strategic dialogue, a new strategic dialogue that expanded cooperation beyond security issues. But then came the flurry of crises in 2011 and 2012, combined with tensions over Afghanistan that really put the US-Pakistan relationship in a precarious place, in a tough place during the last few years of the Obama administration. Certainly, the US-Pakistan relationship is in a very different place now than it was when Biden ended his time as vice president. All this said, while Trump and Biden would share the same broad view of Pakistan, I think there are three sharp policy differences between the two men on other foreign policy issues that I think would have an indirect but notable impact on US-Pakistan relations. And in all three cases, I think that Biden's position would actually impact Pakistan in a positive way. First, I think it's quite safe to say that a President Biden would take perhaps a bit of a more conciliatory approach toward Iran. There's a good chance that he would try to get the US back into the Iran civil nuclear deal, which is of course an agreement that Obama helped broker. This would ease, even if only modestly, US-Iran tensions, and that, I think, would be a good thing for Pakistan, which understandably doesn't want the US-Iran rivalry to spin out of control. Second, a President Biden would likely take a slightly, and I emphasize slightly, more conciliatory approach toward China. Biden, like Trump, would look at China as a strategic competitor, a strategic rival, and indeed a strategic threat, and I'll get to this in a moment. But a President Biden, I think, would be more willing to pursue avenues for cooperation where they exist. And Biden has talked specifically about looking at areas like climate change, non-proliferation, global health security as areas where the US could seek cooperation with China. And this, again, I think would be a good thing for Pakistan. Third, a Biden presidency would likely be more willing than the Trump administration to be critical of India on human rights issues, including those in Kashmir. I would not overstate this, though. Given the bipartisan importance ascribed to US-India partnership, I imagine that criticism would be relatively muted from the administration, and I think that much of this criticism would come from typical suspects in terms of Democrats on Capitol Hill and other non-executive branch government agencies like the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. And I think it's also important to remember that much of the recent criticism from Democrats specifically targeted the measures that followed the Article 370 revocation and also the new Indian citizenship law. It was not, that criticism was not broader criticism of Indian policy. But that said, Biden and Kamala Harris, his vice presidential candidate, have made a few negative comments about Kashmir and the citizenship law, particularly in terms of the threat they pose to Muslims. And what we saw with the Obama administration, and specifically a speech that President Obama gave in New Delhi in which he subtly criticized religious freedom issues in India, we've seen that Democratic presidents are willing to be publicly critical of the US as strategic partner. And once again, I think this would be something that would be viewed as a good thing in Islamabad, but I would not overstate that issue all that much. Beyond all this, more broadly, I would argue that the US-Pakistan relationship will be approaching an inflection point, which when the new administration takes off, no matter who wins the election. The US footprint in Afghanistan is receding, and that is a trend that is unlikely to change no matter who wins the election, given strong bipartisan support in favor of a withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. I think that President Biden would probably support a more gradual withdrawal of troops than Trump would, but both would support a withdrawal. And for several decades, as I think we all know, US policy toward Pakistan has oftentimes been viewed through the lens of Afghanistan. But with the US set to greatly reduce its presence in Afghanistan, the US-Pakistan relationship will need to identify a new basis sooner rather than later. This does not mean that Afghanistan will suddenly stop impacting US thinking about Pakistan. It still will, though the extent of that impact will depend on what the situation is on the ground in Afghanistan in the coming months, and that's hard to predict. We really don't know what that situation will be. We don't know how much of a troop presence the US will maintain. Biden, and after some cajoling from his advisors, Trump as well, I'm sure, would both likely support a small counterterrorism focused force in Afghanistan. But we don't know if that's indeed what will happen. We don't know when that would happen. We also don't know what the status of peace talks with the Taliban will be in the next few months. I think that so long as the peace process continues and so long as US troops remain in the country, the US-Pakistan relationship from a Biden or a Trump administration perspective would continue to pivot around Afghanistan. At the same time, looking ahead to the coming months, if the peace process were to collapse, if the US maintained a small presence in Afghanistan, and if the Taliban were to ramp up its attacks, if US troops are attacked, and if there are deaths of US troops, again, then the US-Pakistan relationship could face some tough times again. But we really just don't know how this will all play out in Afghanistan. But looking beyond the shorter term issues, we do need to be thinking about the inevitability of a post-America Afghanistan and what that means for US-Pakistan relations. And as I said, either a Biden or a Trump administration will need to establish a new basis for the relationship. And what should this new basis or bases be? I think there could be various options. Counterterrorism certainly has been an object of both cooperation and contention in recent years, with the US no longer fighting the Taliban and concerned as much about the sanctuary issue. The contention may not be as present. Anti-state terrorism is not nearly the threat in Pakistan that it used to be, but there still may be scope for cooperation around shared threats like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Trade and investment can potentially be a new basis for the relationship as well. It's something the Trump administration expressed a willingness to pursue, but didn't really follow through on substantive levels, mainly because the focus continued to be on the situation in Afghanistan and also on counterterrorism issues. I think that the problem here is that whether or not we have a Trump 2.0 or a Biden administration, longstanding US government concerns about Pakistan's investment climate could preclude this type of cooperation. A lack of sufficient appropriate legislation, anxieties about intellectual property rights, taxation issues, too much red tape, all of these types of concerns could constrain more economic cooperation. Regardless of whether Trump or Biden wins the election, I think the US-Pakistan relationship will face several obstacles as it tries to reorient itself in anticipation of a US withdrawal from Afghanistan. The first obstacle for US-Pakistan relations is a US-China rivalry that is here to stay for quite some time. China is and will be the foremost US foreign policy concern on a bipartisan level. There's only so far that the US-Pakistan relationship can go, I think, on strategic levels, given the reality of that China-Pakistan partnership. It will be hard for America to pursue deeper ties with a nation that is so closely aligned with Washington's top strategic rival. And another problem here, a related problem, is that Pakistan invariably gets dragged into the US-China rivalry. I think that's already happened with CPEC. The Trump administration came out publicly against CPEC last year, not really because of Pakistan, but because of China and its opposition to the broader BRI enterprise. I think that most people, when thinking back to the speech that Ambassador Alice Wells made at the Wilson Center about a year ago, last November, about CPEC, the tendency is to focus on how she criticized CPEC, but fewer people remember that the second half of her speech was actually a pitch for more US investment in Pakistan, using a different investment model than the Chinese one. Second obstacle to US-Pakistan relations post-US election, I think, would be the US relationship with India. And here I don't see the mere existence of this relationship as a problem for US-Pakistan relations. My sense is that there's an acknowledgement in Pakistan that the US-India relationship is here to stay, and that there are ways to work around that reality, including by doubling down on the partnership with Beijing, as well as by intensifying relations with other friends like Turkey and increasingly Russia. But I think where US-India ties could become a problem for US-Pakistan relations is that they are evolving in a way that will be perceived in Pakistan as explicitly pushing for Indian interests, and especially in terms of terrorism and the issue of India-focused terrorist groups on Pakistani soil, like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. You know, Biden published an op-ed in the publication India West a few days back. This is a publication, an Indian-American publication. He published an op-ed on his vision for US-India relations, and the framing he used for the relationship was very interesting. He said, quote, "The US and India will stand together against terrorism in all its forms and work together to promote a region of peace and stability where neither China nor any other country threatens its neighbors," unquote. So in effect, he was framing the relationship around terrorism first and then China. So this suggests that if there's a Biden administration, the issue of these India-focused groups could become a bigger tension point in US-Pakistan relations. Afghanistan-focused groups had been a tension point for quite some time, but now there's a possibility that the India-focused ones could come more to the fore, particularly in that context of what I had said about Biden's op-ed if he's elected president. Neither a Trump or a Biden administration, though, would want to shrug this stuff off, and for good reasons. Bears remembering that the Mumbai terror attacks did kill 6 Americans. So the US government has a very clear and direct reason to want to continue to be seized of this. So third challenge, and I'll start wrapping up here, a third challenge to US-Pakistan relations post-election, regardless of who wins, is the mistrust factor. I think that perceptions of Pakistan have softened in Washington in recent years, especially as the relationship has improved. You don't hear as many people worrying about the nuclear security issue that you don't hear as much about anymore, and particularly with the reduction of terrorism and the overall improvement of the security environment in Pakistan. But there's still a lot of bilateral baggage from the past, particularly from the 2011-2012 years, as well as the war in Afghanistan. And these are things that impact the thinking of many in Washington about Pakistan. And a lot of this baggage did play out during the Obama years, which suggests that mistrust factor may be a bit tougher to dislodge if you have a Biden administration. And I should say that Biden very famously proclaimed in a conversation with Hamid Karzai years back that Pakistan is, quote, 50 times more important to the US than is Afghanistan. And I think many in Pakistan may take that as a positive comment about Pakistan, and I'm not quite sure he meant it that way. My sense is that he was referring to Pakistan as an important country, at least in part because of the volatilities there, the interplay of extremism, terrorism, nuclear weapons, and so on, that posed a threat to US interests. Pakistan, of course, is a lot different now than it was when he made that comment, but we shouldn't necessarily think that based on that comment that his views of Pakistan are overwhelmingly rosy. So where to go from here? I'll just end by saying something that I've been saying for a number of years, though I don't know if anyone listens, so people frequently don't listen to what I say. The US-Pakistan relationship, I think, can make a lot of progress, a lot more progress if it's pursued more through non-official channels. About a decade ago, Mark Grossman, in the US Special Envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan, he said that 90% of US-Pakistan relations were government to government. That's very high. I'd be curious to know if that figure has changed in recent years. And if you look at the potential in terms of the US business community, international entrepreneurs, the long and rich tradition of private US-Pakistan educational exchanges, sister city programs, there's a lot there. And you do have a Pakistani diaspora in the US that is well equipped to serve as a bridge through organizations like the America-Pakistan Foundation. You've got many dynamic young Pakistani Americans who are keen to leverage the promise of the IT and high-tech industries in Pakistan to build cooperation. So I think that's an area to look at, one that has a lot of potential. no matter who wins the election. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kugelman, for your views on the subject. Now, our next speaker, Ms. Tamanna Salikuddin, I would like to request her to please present her views on the same theme. Over to you, ma'am.
Good morning to everyone joining us in the States, and good evening to everyone in South Asia. Thank you to the Wilson Center and the Islamabad Policy Research Institute for inviting me to take part in today's webinar, and it's great to see so many people interested in this topic. I just want to preface by saying I think Michael and I largely agree on the framing of this issue. My name is Tamanna Salikuddin. I'm currently the Director for South Asia Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. The U.S. Institute of Peace, or USIP, is a national, nonpartisan, independent institute founded by the U.S. Congress and dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. Before I came to USIP, I was a civil servant in the US government for over 12 years, serving across administrations in the Bush administration, Obama, and Trump administrations. And today I'll be sharing my own opinions, neither USG nor USIP's views. And obviously these are largely nonpartisan comments. As Michael alluded to, there are a lot of differences between the two candidates in terms of domestic politics and even in some areas of foreign policy. But I think on South Asia, there really isn't that much of a difference. And so these are based largely on my observations while serving in government, but beyond. And for my career as a foreign policy civil servant focused on South Asia, I want to emphasize that much of US foreign policy and national security, when it comes to South Asia particularly, does not change significantly based on our national elections, nor which political party is in charge. In fact, in my time in government, I saw more continuity of national security interests than drastic changes. Various administrations and also various members of the US Congress may have different styles, techniques, or approaches, but especially since 9/11, US foreign policy with regard to Pakistan has maintained largely bipartisan national security priorities. So as alluded to in the publicity materials for this event, US-Pakistan relations have at times lurched from the strategic to the transactional. And I would argue that both countries have wanted to maintain some semblance of a positive relationship and have worked to look for areas of convergence. However, over the last 20 years, there have been significant areas of divergence that have made a strong strategic relationship elusive. And to be clear, I have been a proponent of a US-Pakistan relationship, but one that is realistic. At times in the US, many critics might call the US-Pakistan relationship schizophrenic or contradictory. In reality, it's that there are many areas of convergence and of divergence, and you can't really change those strategic realities. So just as a way of background, if we're thinking about how is this going to change in the next with the next election here in the United States, I think it's useful to think about this in the last 3 administrations. So in the post 9/11 period, US-Pakistan relations have been a roller coaster. At the height of General Musharraf era cooperation in 2004, Pakistan was declared a major non-NATO ally. We saw both sides claiming strategic relations, and there's a high level of military and development assistance flowing to Pakistan. And supported by then Senator Biden, to be honest. The US has provided high technology weapons, platforms, grant assistance to Pakistan, including $14.6 billion in appropriations through the Coalition Support Fund program from 2002 to 2016. That stopped under President Trump, but if you look very closely, that was already set to stop, and the waivers under President Obama weren't happening. So I wouldn't call this, one side or the other that stopped the CSF. And yet this period of immense interaction between US and Pakistan has been marked by negative public opinion about the other in both countries. So you see people in Pakistan, when polled, have, at the height of this cooperation, had very negative views of the US, and vice versa. You had high levels of negative opinion in the US. It's interesting, as the relationship has become more modest and there are maybe less active areas of cooperation, levels of animosity have also gone down, as Michael alluded to. From the US perspective, I think there were efforts across several administrations to change Pakistan's strategic calculus, especially about counterterrorism and other areas of disagreement. But what that has done, the failure to change strategic calculus, which we can have a debate of, even if that's something you should try to do. But over the last 20 years of interaction, I think the US policymaker and legislator does have this this sort of memory and has understood that a relationship with Pakistan is important, is strategically important, but they've developed an overall view that's one that Pakistan harbors multiple terrorist groups, has a growing arsenal of dangerous nuclear weapons, internal instability. It doesn't play nice with other US allies in the region, namely Afghanistan and India. And we can argue whether these are true or false and whose perceptions they are. But I think what's very important to think about is for a generation of US military and diplomatic officials who have served in Afghanistan, Pakistan was often seen as the source of the problem. I myself served at the National Security Council for 3 years, starting a few weeks after the bin Laden raid as director for Pakistan. And really our focus was rebalancing the US-Pakistan relationship, bringing it out from, sort of the trough of the relationship and making it something more reasonable, something more manageable. And even then, transactional was the dreaded word. We didn't necessarily think we could get to a strategic relationship, but we didn't want a transactional one. I think there is, as Michael alluded to, a bit of an upswing now due to cooperation between the US and Pakistan on the Afghan peace process. However, I would argue that the overall trajectory has been one of more modest expectations. It's interesting, if you look at the State Department's website now under a Trump administration, it sounds very much like what you would hear in Obama or Bush administration, and I would argue probably what you'd hear in a Biden administration. So, the State Department talks about a multifaceted relationship with Pakistan in areas ranging from counterterrorism to energy to trade and investment. Pakistani forces have made significant sacrifices in recent years to reclaim parts of their country previously held by militant groups. Pakistan also has taken some action against externally focused militant groups and UN-designated terrorist organizations operating from its territory in accordance with its National Action Plan Against Terrorism and Prime Minister Imran Khan's public commitments. In line with the South Asia strategy announced by the president in August 2017, the US continues to urge Pakistan to take decisive and irreversible action against these groups. Now, that, there's all this positive stuff, and then there's that last sentence, which you could say is the do more sentence. And so that dichotomy has really characterized US-Pakistan relations, not just in this administration, but also in the previous 2 administrations. I would argue that the national security priorities have remained largely consistent. What you've seen is different techniques, whether you want a strategic relationship, a transactional, do we use carrots, sticks? Is it a large relationship, a modest one? Do we focus on civilian to civilian ties? Do we focus more on military ties? But at the same time, I think it's really interesting to look at what national security priorities have been outlined in the US for our relationship with Pakistan. In April 2001, in the Bush era, this is before 9/11, the United States had several identifiable interests in South Asia during the post-Cold War period. And these included developing a strong economic and strategic relationship with India, curbing Islamic extremism, containing terrorist activity in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and preventing a potentially dangerous nuclear arms race on the subcontinent. To me, it's remarkable that even before 9/11, we were talking about the same things. When I was in the Obama administration, similarly, it was nuclear security and stability, countering international terrorism, and de-escalation of any conflict between India and Pakistan that were our overarching national security interests. If you pay attention to President Trump's South Asia strategy in August 2017, he lines up and says the exact same thing. He talks about America's interests as being stopping the resurgence of safe havens that enable terrorists to threaten America, preventing nuclear weapons and materials from coming into hands of terrorists and being used against us or anywhere in the world. So, he comes back to the same nuclear security and countering terrorism. It's interesting, from these, he also extrapolates the same goals as previous administrations. So not a hasty exit from Afghanistan, which is what he initially wanted. Let's all just leave Afghanistan. But he's convinced, President Trump has been convinced that rather we should have a peace process and a responsible exit due to the presence of international terrorism. And on Pakistan, the same dichotomy, that Pakistan is a valued partner, our militaries have worked together against common enemies, the Pakistani people have suffered greatly from terrorism and extremism, but at the same time, we want them to work hard to stop the groups that we believe are being sheltered there and that are killing our soldiers in Afghanistan. So I think it's very likely that either a Biden or Trump administration will have these two overarching national security interests, one about international terrorism and two about the safety and security of nuclear issues and nuclear escalation. And while I would argue, yes, as Michael said, there may be less worry about nuclear material falling into the hands of terrorists, I think there is a lot of worry about escalation between India and Pakistan. And so the nuclear security and nuclear stability remains one of our main national security interests. While the title of this webinar is really interesting, Trump versus Biden, it's quite juicy, I would posit that it's not really who wins the election, but the developments in Pakistan's strategic neighborhood that will shape the future of U.S.-Pakistan relations. And I'm just going to quickly go through them, as Michael has already talked a lot about them. I think number one is Afghanistan. For as long as we can remember, and I would say even before 9/11, instability and war in Afghanistan has really shaped and influenced U.S.-Pakistan relations. And Vice President Biden has, in his campaign materials, has said Biden will end the forever wars in Afghanistan, which have cost us untold blood and treasure. And he has long argued that he will bring the vast majority of our troops home from Afghanistan and narrowly focus our mission on Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I mean, if you read these words, you could think that President Trump would say the exact same things. So I think there is growing just bipartisan consensus on this, and especially on the idea of a peace process. The peace process, I would argue, is the largest area of convergence in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. When it is going well, the relationship is much better. And you can see that. The first 2 years of the Trump administration, U.S.-Pakistan relations were not going well. When we see positive progress in the peace process, U.S.-Pakistan relationships are much, much stronger. The peace process, for what it's worth, is now accepted as the best path forward in the majority of U.S. policymaking circles. Back in 2008, when reconciliation or the peace process was first announced, it was a bad word. A lot of pushback in Washington, Kabul, Pentagon, the Hill. It's taken years, but now it's become almost conventional wisdom. And everyone is looking for some version of making a deal with the Taliban so that the US troops can withdraw down in Afghanistan. The differences are really going to be in exactly what that end game is, what deal or what end state an administration is willing to accept. But it will be defined really by Taliban breaking ties with international terrorism and making political accommodations for the rest of the Afghan polity. The differences between Obama and Trump, and I would argue also on Biden, will really be the sequencing of the talks, whether you have the government of Afghanistan at the table, the speed of the drawdown, what conditions these are based around, but the actual goals will largely be the same. I think if the peace process doesn't go well, then U.S.-Pakistan relationship would sour again. You'd be back to the do more, safe havens frame. And the divergences that right now are conveniently sidelined due to the peace process will be front and center if the peace process breaks down and war in Afghanistan resurges. Crucially, I think a U.S. envoy that is focused on the peace process, such as Ambassador Khalilzad, has played a critical role in revitalizing U.S.-Pakistan relations and cooperation by spending a lot of time, I think, in Islamabad and Pindi. Regardless of who wins the next, who wins next week, the next administration will have to spend a great deal of time and effort to bring the Afghan peace process to full fruition, to draw down troops in Afghanistan, and hopefully to manage the implementation of a longer-term peace deal that provides some sort of stability, connectivity, and even a peace dividend to the region. And those things are what will truly, I think, influence the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. Even when we sign a peace deal, it doesn't mean that peace will break out. That implementation phase and continuing to monitor stability there will really depend a lot on the U.S.-Pakistan relation. The second point I want to make is the US-India relationship. And while Pakistan might not always be happy about it, and we can see from the trolls that it's quite an emotional topic, the continuing pursuit of a strategic relationship between US and India will definitely impact the future of US-Pakistan relations. I think if you look at statements from President Trump and Vice President Biden, or even President Bush, President Clinton, President Obama, there has been this commitment to a long-term strategic partnership with India. And it is based on many things. They see, I think, US national security interest sees India as a regional and emerging global power that can provide regional security. It's largely shaped by our interest in containing China's influence in the region, and really thinking about the Asia Pacific region and India's role in shaping that landscape. I think what's very interesting is that the recent 2x2 that was held, on October 27th, when India finally sealed the long-awaited Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement with the US. This has been pending since 2016. This is part of work that the Pentagon was doing under President Obama. So there is largely institutional continuity, whether it's the 2015 framework for US-India defense relationship, but BECA is part of a 3-part defense agreement. So under President Obama in 2016, they signed the first part, Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement. In 2018, under President Trump, they signed the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement. And now they've signed the last piece of this, BECA. So my point is that whether it's Biden or Trump, you are going to see institutional continuity in terms of US-India relations. And I think, the Pentagon would argue that over the past decade, the US-India defense relationship has become indispensable to them for stability in the Asia Pacific and Indian Ocean region. And I think nowhere is that more prominent that America's oldest and largest geographic combatant command changed its name from US Pacific Command to US Indo-Pacific Command. And that's not going to change or go backwards, based on the election. And I think the point about human rights, which I'll touch on briefly later, it is important that a Biden administration may be more willing to call out human rights, but I think that will not be determinative of a US-India or a US-Pakistan relationship. The last point, I do want to mention some of the personal affinities. So we often think it's person to person, maybe President Trump gets along with Prime Minister Modi better, but I would say he also got along with Prime Minister Imran Khan. President Obama got along with Prime Minister Singh well. But again, I don't think these personal affinities or personal relationships shape the overall strategic goals and interests of whether it's US-India relations or US-Pakistan relations. And lastly, I do want to mention China. So there is a growing bipartisan consensus in the US that China is emerging as the greatest challenge the US faces in the field of foreign affairs, and its aggressive global behavior impacts the US in many negative ways. I think it's very pertinent in South Asia, not just in Pakistan, but if we look Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, other, beyond just Pakistan. And for Pakistan, I think it's very important because Pakistan has long maintained positive ties with both the US and China, both military and economic, and has actively tried to balance these ties and even use one as the buffer for the other. I think it would be very detrimental both for Pakistan and the US if we allow these relationships to break into blocks of US, India, and China, Pakistan. I think when thinking strategically, US policymakers don't necessarily want that to happen, though I think there are some, maybe in Congress and other places, who maybe have too much trauma of dealing with the Afghan war, who are like, fine, let Pakistan be in China's orbit. But when it comes down to our national security interests, this drift towards China is not good for US national security interests. And we don't want to create these impenetrable opposing blocks of India, US, Pakistan, China. I think the Biden administration might be marginally more likely to do some cooperation on areas like Afghanistan with China, but at the same time, in the Obama administration, Vice President Biden has the experience of trying to cooperate with China on areas like Afghanistan. I myself have sat through many QCGs in Pakistan, and we were surprised how little cooperation we could actually get. Pakistan and Afghanistan were far more willing to cooperate than the Chinese were. So, while they might be willing to try some cooperation, I don't think there is a very substantive level of cooperation in South Asia, which either administration could really find. Lastly, I want to talk about some of the other issues that are out there. I would argue that these are less important, they're more or less important depending on the administration, but I don't think they're determinative. A Biden administration will likely have more emphasis on human rights and democratic norms. They've argued that they will focus on multilateral partnerships and diplomacy, arms control regimes, and climate change. But I don't think those are going to change our strategic goals in South Asia. So as I said, there may be more talk about civilian governance, media freedom, strong independent judiciaries, not just critique of Kashmir, but I think across the board. So critique of Pakistan, critique of Sri Lanka with the Rajapaksas, critique of India as well. But yet that critique will be balanced, whether it should be public or private, how much impact it will actually have on our cooperation with these states, especially military to military cooperation. Lastly, I would say that trade and economic issues and the impact of COVID will also be very important in either administration. I think given how many people will fall into extreme poverty due to the fallout from COVID-19, many of those will be in South Asia, wiping out decades of development work. Both administrations will face needs from all across the world. So it'll be very interesting to see how much of that need in Pakistan with Pakistan's economic needs would be met or helped by the US. Both President Trump, in 2019, President Trump called for a dramatic expansion of US-Pakistan commercial ties. And if you remember, Vice President Biden, when he was Senator Biden, actually was one of the authors of the Kerry Lugar Biden-Berman bill. So both of them at times have championed more either aid or trade. With Trump, it's more trade, and I think Biden would be more willing to do more aid. But both of them have faced severe barriers to making that work. So whether it was regulatory barriers, weak intellectual property protections, or other things that impeded US firms or US assistance, I don't think either of them has the key to fixing Pakistan's economy. And so Pakistan will likely be looking towards a host of different allies to take care of its needs. With that, I just want to end with most of these things are structural challenges, and the institutional memory in the US, while people say it's not great, it does have some sense of deja vu, and there will be that institutional shift that will be hard to change right away. And President Trump has experienced that, President Obama experienced it, and whoever wins next week will likely have the same thing when it comes to US-Pakistan relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Ladies and gentlemen, we now move on to our second sub-theme, which is what impact US elections could have on the policy options for Pakistan. So now we're seeing the other side of the picture. For that, I would like to invite from her scenic background, Dr. Rabia Akhtar, for her views on this on this theme. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. If you hear some explosions in the background, they are the fireworks in my neighborhood, so please excuse that. I'd like to thank IPRI for inviting me to be a part of this panel, and I congratulate you for the 2+2 series initiative, kicking it off with this very important subject. Pakistan's relationship with the US is an extremely important one, which we have never taken for granted. Over a period of time, this relationship has evolved and has seen its ups and downs. Historically, this relationship has been that of aid and sanctions. There is history of grievances on both sides, and both sides have felt misunderstood by the other, either for their motivations or actions. And this has been irrespective of which administration has been in power. So while the topic today is on Trump versus Biden, but like my fellow panelists have stated earlier, this relationship is beyond that leadership variable, given mutual national security interest and geopolitical drivers in the region, where US has great political and strategic stakes. So having said that, let me not go back into the history of this relationship. Let's focus on the future. I'm sure that Pakistan by now has already charted out the trajectory of its relationship with the US, keeping in mind three things. Number one, where are we today? Number two, where do we want to go? And number three, how do we get there? Like Tamanna also pointed out, but did not go into the detail, there are some areas of convergences and divergences in Pak-US relations. And they exist and they're not dependent on the type of administration in power. So firstly, I'll talk briefly about the areas of convergences that I see. Number one is political stability in Afghanistan. Taliban and the intra-Afghan factions bring them, making sure that the intra-Afghan peace process is a success so that US forces could withdraw the region. Second is the economic stability in Pakistan, which is an equal stake for both Pakistan and US. Third is counter-terrorism and intelligence sharing. Fourth is peace and stability in broader South Asia. Fifth is US role in Indo-Pak crisis management. Sixth is democracy and human rights. And seventh is defense cooperation. The areas of while these are the areas of convergences, areas of divergences have historically existed and continue to exist. And this is where Pakistan, I believe, needs to communicate clearly and unambiguously what it wants from the US. First is the lack of sensitivity from the US with respect to Pakistan's threat perceptions. And this is not the story of today, it has historically been so. So that needs a course correction. For example, the Indo-US strategic partnership, lack of sensitivity when offensive armaments are sold to India, either directly or facilitated through other countries like Israel, with the knowledge that they'll be used against Pakistan at some point. It has happened in the past too, when in 1965, both countries used US supplied weapons against each other provided to them under the Mutual Assistance Program, which was part of the broader Mutual Defense Assistance Act. At least in 1965, there was parity in supply to both India and Pakistan, and both underwent the arms embargo post 65. You cannot talk of peace and stability on one hand while feeding the sources of instability in the region by arms sales on the other. And this needs to be communicated to the US and to the incoming administration, whether that remains Trump 2.0 or Biden. BECA and other Indo-US defense and logistic agreements are also a case in point here, where lack of sensitivity is an issue and challenge for Pakistan. Second, there has been lack of acknowledgement for Pakistan's counterterrorism efforts and sacrifices made by both its soldiers and people since 2001. That acknowledgement needs to come, and it need not come at a price. There is a recent resurgence in terrorist attacks in Pakistan by terrorists hiding in Afghanistan who have made a pact against the state of Pakistan funded by India. Pakistan should have a strong expectation from the US and convey it so to talk to those who fund terror activities inside Pakistan and provide them safe havens. It cannot be a one-way street where Pakistan is cornered on the issue of terrorism and safe havens. Number third, two more areas where divergences exist are CPAC and the broader China and Pakistan question. Both look at it differently. It requires certain, official level exchanges to address US concerns. And lastly, Taman also mentioned that safety and security of Pakistan's nuclear weapons program and the broader non-proliferation question. Solo positive statements from the US have come, but they lack overall confidence in the custodial arrangement. So there needs to be more dialogue on that. Going forward, there are three broad areas in which there are mutual expectations that would set the tone for the future of Pak-US relations, irrespective of which administration comes to power. Number one is Afghanistan. Number two is navigating US-China rivalry, strategic rivalry, I would say, in the and where Pakistan fits into it. And the third is charting out bilateral Pak-US conversations in various areas. So first, Afghanistan, and within that, the future of intra-Afghan peace process. Pakistan has gone to extraordinary lengths to bring the relevant stakeholders to the negotiating table, which resulted in the US recognition of Taliban as a political entity, with which they signed the historic agreement on February 29, 2020. Pakistan's efforts for peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan started in 2009, scoping US commitment in Afghanistan, airstrikes, and peace negotiations. It was also the year when the Afghan government had explored the potential for negotiations with the Taliban leadership with the support of Pakistani government. So Pakistan must not let the US incoming US administration forget the critical role it has played in shaping whatever successes US claims in Pakistan today. And should the intra-Afghan peace process falter, for whatever reasons that are evident to almost all present in this Zoom room today and outside this, Pakistan should not be scapegoated for it. Second is the China-US strategic rivalry. So Pakistan should maintain a balancing act between US and China and not take sides in this strategic competition. In fact, it should try to move away from being seen through the lens of China-Pakistan prism, which is akin to the AFPAC prism, which the US ultimately developed for Pakistan. It did not serve the purpose then, and it will not serve the purpose for Pakistan if it is to be seen by the US in that light. So I believe that Pakistan needs to distance itself from being bracketed in with China or be only seen through that calculus. China has always supported Pakistan's relationship with the US. In fact, a positive relationship between Pakistan and US is beneficial for China because it wants least resistance for CPEC or BRI in the region by extra-regional forces like the US itself. So therefore, Pakistan not taking clear sides would be understandable by China. If in future there is a Sino-US rapprochement, Pakistan will ideally be in a position to bring both parties together like it did when they first stepped out of the closet in the 70s. Third, what should the bilateral Pak-US conversation be about, irrespective again of which administration comes in? There are 5 key areas in which the dialogue can be proposed and resumed on priority. Number 1 is energy. Second is security, strategic stability, and non-proliferation. Third is to have a defense consultative group. Fourth is economic, finance, and trade. And fifth could be science, technology, and education. Pakistan can approach the new administration post US elections to revive the strategic dialogue that Pakistan once had with the US. Another important area that I see within such conversation is of US role in facilitating Pakistan's commercial ties with its neighbors, whereby facilitating Pakistan's regional integration should be an expectation Pakistan should clearly convey to the US at this stage. Convey to the US that CPEC is not a zero-sum game for Pakistan and that it wants more than a mere working relationship with the US via DFC or US aid projects. It should also encourage the US in bringing private investments to Pakistan, and corporate America must be facilitated. So from where I see it, for Pakistan-US relations, it is not important whether a Democratic or a Republican government comes in. We have been there, done that, worked with both types. Now, the issues that face us, as I've charted out, I don't see the variable of party type providing any advantage. Geopolitics for sure is the driver for this relationship for unforeseeable future. And Pakistan figures prominently and cannot be denied its rightful place in the US political calculus. I'd like to stop here and would be looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rabia. Now I would like to invite Dr. Hussain Nadeem for his views on the same theme. Dr. Hussain, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And welcome to Islamabad Policy Research Institute first joint event with the Wilson Center. I'm very happy to be here myself. And I'd also like to welcome my friend Michael, my friend Rabia, and Tamanna, who took out the time to be part of this webinar. As you know, we recently relaunched IPRI as a new and modern think tank. We have upgraded our new policy and research products, and also have come up with the new entire outlook. So do check it out when you have time. I'd also like to thank the participants of this meeting who are here, and also people. Since it's Friday night in Pakistan, a lot of people are giving up on precious time, and some people on their birthdays as well, since it's the birthday season in the country. So thank you all for for joining this. Uh, Interesting start of the webinar with the Indian trolls attacking this entire forum. Not the first time that India has played a spoiler role in this region, but surprised to see that they're doing that on Zoom as well. So I'll start off with that. Uh, I would like to start with giving some data out because I think it's very important to talk with data on the U.S. Pakistan relations, the past, the present, and the future, because it allows us to see things in a little bit more perspective and a context. So, data number one is the aid under Democrats and Republicans throughout history since 1947. Uh, has largely been exactly the same. And in 40 years of Republican rule, we've received $913 million a year. And in the 30 years of Democrat rule, we've received $914 million a year. So the data tells you that both have actually been equally in terms of giving out aid to Pakistan. I'll talk this a little bit more in detail when I come on the next part of this thing. Number two, I would also talk about when it comes to the U.S.-Pakistan relations, the U.S. presidential visits to Pakistan. I think that's also very telling. There have been a total of 5 U.S. U.S. presidential visits to Pakistan. Uh, Three was from the Republican presidents, and two were the Democrats. The problem is that all five were during the martial law time in Pakistan. Two of them were during the General Ayub Khan's era, and one of them was under General Yahya Khan, and then the rest two were during General Musharraf era. The last US presidential visit was in 2006, if I'm not wrong. President Bush came to Pakistan in 2006 for, I think, a day or so. So in the last 14 years, where the US and Pakistan relations were going through a particular time where there were close relations, there were problems, the love and hate, despite the Kerry-Lugabaman Act, despite all the efforts that Pakistan has really put into the Afghan war and other war on terror generally, there has not been a single US visit during the last 14 years, which is very surprising as well. Third data I want to share is very interesting as well. There is 500,000 Pakistani Pakistani Americans right now in the US. Uh, the trade ties right now are totally built at $6.5 billion, with Pakistan is $1.3 billion trade surplus with the United States. The US also happens to be Pakistan's largest export market. China happens to be, interestingly, Pakistan's largest import market. So that's also an important point to note at. One final thing on the data part I want to mention, which I think is very important as well, because that one data is it's kind of like a mix of both the President Obama's era and under the Trump's era, is indicative of the changes in that. Is the new U.S. embassy, or shall I say the new U.S. compound in Islamabad? It was started in 2015. It got completed in 2017 at a cost of $738 million in Pakistan. It was inaugurated in 2017. If you go and visit that compound, you'll recognize the future and the U.S. interest, strategic interest, and uh, how does the U.S. want to see, where does the U.S. situate Pakistan in the overall U.S. foreign policy? So I would definitely recommend people who've been to the U.S. compound would definitely understand that it's one of the largest U.S. compound, the embassy outside of outside of the U.S. So that's 5 data points that I want to talk about. Now, what deductions do I take out of this? And the reason why I wanted to give this data is because the the history of the US Pakistan relations and the present and the future it is, where it's going to go, is not really hard to comprehend. I think personally, as academics, I come from an academic background as well. I think we've complicated this relationship a little more try to theorize a little bit more than what actually the relationship is. And I'm going to take off my institutional hat and wear a policy hat on this and be more blunt about what exactly has happened. You see, Pakistan has moved from the US-Iran policy in 1951 after Mossadegh eras. That was the first time we actually received aid. A lot of people don't recognize that Pakistan's first aid was received after the disturbances in Iran. So Pakistan was configured in the US-Iran policy. So we moved from the US-Iran policy towards US policy in Soviet Union, towards non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation, towards Afghanistan again, towards war on terror, back towards Afghanistan peace process, and now slowly shifting towards China. So that has been the total trajectory of US-Pakistan bilateral relations. I'm not sure exactly what part of it this is bilateral. Pakistan relation has always been, and I think it's a cliche now as well, that it's always been about something else. And I don't blame the United States for it, partly because I think the disturbances in Pakistan, the domestic political struggle and the tug of war between the civil military have also influenced exactly what type of relations we want to have with the United States, and also with the circumstances on our borders kind of dictated Pakistan to become a security actor under the Bitat Pact or under the war on terror. So we played with the cards that we were provided to Pakistan. But the relationship has moved from one external actor to another external actor to now, I think we're slipping towards the US-China account as we are moving away from the Afghanistan peace process. But to understand all of this, I think we need to go a little bit deeper into the academic side of things, where I feel that it's very easy to talk about US-Pakistan relations in eras and the flow of the aid. But really what the relationship is essentially a very post-colonial relation. We moved from the British Raj to a kind of American Raj in a way, where we have Pakistan as a periphery country for the United States. So what goes on in Pakistan and is part of the US periphery foreign policy mindset. So the US wants to have a relation, but for a specific purposes. Pakistan at the same time wants to have that relation as a core country, but the struggle to be there also requires Pakistan to undergo a radical shift, which it also resists in a lot of ways. Moving forward, one of the few important points that I want to talk about now is the current status. And I think Tamanna and Rabi also mentioned this thing that Pakistan-US relations are beyond Trump and Biden. I do agree some point around that. Geopolitically, yes, but Trump versus Biden, the reason why the conversation of this talk is titled that way is because I think we live in an era where the US specifically, and now in Pakistan, there is a radical shift in the overall environment. Uh, President Trump took the Republican Party to a very different angle. He has taken a radical shift and basically disrupted the entire US foreign policy apparatus as well. So for Pakistan, Trump versus Biden does matter. Part of the reason is because not because it changes the geopolitical scenario. We're still going to be under the US Afghanistan tag or under the US foreign policy on China. But how that policy actually activates or how does the policy function, that's very different. So while the Republicans and the Democrats have given each amount of the similar amount of aid, or they have particular same talking points over Pakistan, the way they conduct their policy is very different. Or so I'll give you a small example of this thing is the Democrats are a lot more intrusive in Pakistan's domestic politics. They want to do the politicking. They also want to involve themselves too much into changing Islam from within, funding madrasa, funding this, funding that, down to that level into the Kerry Lugar Berman Act. And my PhD was on the Kerry Lugar Berman. So I have seen and I've done data on exactly how the US foreign aid was being dispersed to the media houses, to NGOs that never existed, to change the society's architecture, to do the social re-engineering the way I remember back in the day State Department officials would state it. So Pakistan naturally got very triggered back in the days. I think it was General Kiani was the chief at that point, and Asif Ali Zardari Sahab was the president. The 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 sentiment in Islamabad and Lahore was very hostile because you would have the Americans with their guns and with their money roaming around like it was Eid or something. So that type of intrusiveness is very problematic. The Republicans have a different way of dealing with Pakistan. They have similar policies. They want similar results. but they don't want to get into that level of knit and grit. They don't want to play the civil military divide. They don't want to change Pakistan from within or Islam. Uh, so those policies do matter when it comes to the policy practice. And this is why the Trump versus Biden is very important for Pakistan, where I sit right now and with the way we look at it. You see, the first problem right there is not the fact that there's going to be any monumental changes in the policy, but again, the way the policy will be done. For instance, I think there was another point raised by, I think, one of the speakers over here, but the crux of that point was essentially that, you see, the US policy, what happens in the neighborhood. Yeah, sorry. So I think Tamanna mentioned about this thing that the US policy on Pakistan and the changes will be driven partly by how the strategic environment in the region will change. I do agree, but I also disagree, because the strategic environment in our region is a lot linked to the US presidential elections. So if you have Trump winning the elections, you may see an Afghan policy that is more stable. It will be a continuation of what is already going on. With President Biden, I think that will be different, because we foresee a lot more conditions on Taliban. I think the dialogue will change. You will have a lot more support with the Afghan government. You will see Taliban being pushed back, new conditions may be emerging on top of things, and that may derail the Afghanistan peace process, because you see, in our parts of the region, peace process is very tricky. Taliban has a leadership which is there to exist. They don't have elections as per se. Uh, for the US change in the government, the changes in the conditions of the peace deal might affect the Pakistan's relations with the US. My fear is that under the President Biden, Afghanistan peace process may be derailed either, or two, Pakistan will be asked to do a lot more. So those things do have an impact. I'll now quickly just go over the few points on how I think the two administrations would have a direct impact on Pakistan. I think with Pakistan, with President Trump, the opportunities are very simple and straightforward. There is a lot more stability in Afghanistan peace process. I think Pakistan will be a lot more comfortable. Our policy options will be a continuation, because we've built a relation with President Trump for the past 2 or 3 years. The do more and the entire idea about Pakistan not doing enough is on the back seat, and Pakistan is kind of appreciated in the Washington circles on the Afghan peace process. So I think that is very big plus for Pakistan if President Trump wins the election. Oh, and the second part is also the President Trump's approach that he doesn't want to really include himself into the Pakistani politics and has a hands-off approach. So that also is kind of favorable to Pakistan, where the Americans are not intruding down to the ground level. The challenges with the Trump administration are also very problematic. And that is one big problem, is the China balance. Pakistan will have to balance this China policy if Trump comes out very aggressive on China, which he is planning to do and has been doing. So for Pakistan to then balance, you see, for Pakistan, I think Rabia did mention that already, Pakistan has been the initiator of US-China relations. For Pakistan, the ideal situation is that the US and China walk together, and Pakistan does not get embroiled into a very complicated situation. But with Trump, Pakistan will have to walk a very fine line, and the balance will be out. Uh, there's also then again another problem is while Trump has a hands-off policy on Pakistan, but there is a fine line between hands-off and a complete disinterest in Pakistan. So for Pakistan, how to keep the United States engaged in a strategic relationship will be a challenge post Afghanistan peace process, and in the middle of while Pakistan will be pushed towards the China account in Trump administration. With President Biden, the opportunities are there. I mean, we all know President Biden was the architect of this Kerry-Lugobaman Act. He was very actively involved. There are a lot of WikiLeaks documents on his conversations with President Zardari at that period. Some very interesting one as well, in how much he wanted to actually involve himself in the Pakistani politics and the changes in the military establishment. He was very well integrated into that. So President Biden understands Pakistan, but the problem is whether that understanding is actually going to help Pakistan or not, or whether there is a particular history with Pakistan. So while Pakistan will find it a lot easier to talk to the Biden administration, which has a history with Pakistan, a lot of Pakistanis, a lot of Muslims, a lot of diversity, a lot of tolerance for other opinions, The real problem is that it may not suit the Pakistani interests at the moment. By all matters right now, Pakistan's strategic interests are served better, I think, under the Trump administration. Then the challenges with the Biden administration is, I feel President Biden may be integrating himself with the civil military issues, the ongoing situation in Pakistan. I think there will be a lot more interest to be a party to Pakistan's current domestic problems. So that could be a big issue, a hands-on approach. And also on the Afghanistan peace process, President Biden would be integrating a lot of human rights angle, a lot of neoliberal project as well in Afghanistan. So how does that impact the Afghanistan peace process and Taliban? That is one question that Pakistan is going to be worried about as well. And the larger thing, one last point I would like to make on that is that unless and until we don't adopt a post-colonial lens to see the U.S. Pakistan relations, it's almost impossible to really deconstruct the two relations. At the same time, though, I don't think the U.S. Pakistan relations, which have been constantly conceived and defined as an imbalance in a relation, I don't think there is an imbalance in the relation. The U.S. Pakistan relations are very well balanced. Both sides know exactly what they want. The U.S. gets what it exactly wants, and the Pakistan has been getting exactly what it wants. The real problem is, I'm going to take the policy hat off and come into a very layman's opinion. The problem in Pakistan is that we've not been able to articulate exactly what we want in terms of non-security issues. So on the security side of the things and the military side of the things, we have things covered. The real problem comes in, where do we want to take the relation? I mean, how much of the conversation between US and Pakistan is spent on STEM for that matter? So in terms of the Pakistan's policy options, what we have, we need to not move only from Afghanistan account to the China account, but we need to develop our own account, our own narrative on exactly what the US-Pakistan relations will be. As a smaller and a weaker party in the relations, I think the onus is on Pakistan to desecuritize the relations, and also not just desecuritize, but provide something else, talking points on the table. If you're not talking about cooperation between think tanks, I mean, one of the reasons I'm very happy that we have this partnership with IPRI, right, IPRI and Wilson Center, is because we need more of these. We need, and not just on the security issues, but beyond security. For instance, one of the topics that I would love to discuss next time is how we can engage on quantum mechanics, for that matter, with the quantum lab in the United States and the quantum work that is going on at LUMS or NUST, how we can integrate these two things together. So on science, tech, education, on entrepreneurship, I think the balance needs to be there in terms of the conversation. And I think that balance has to come from Pakistan. So we take ownership of that. That balance will have to come from the civilian government in the country, and things will start, the relationships may start looking more civil to civil than right now, which we have is very, very off-balance relations. I'll stop at that, and I'm looking forward to the question and answers. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining and listening to us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussain. We are also really lucky to have with us two major stalwarts of the Pakistani diplomatic services, Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhry and Ambassador Asif Durrani. I would request Ambassador Azaz to please share his views. But before I do that, let me just briefly introduce him to the audience. Not that he doesn't need an introduction, but still, he has served as the Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, and he's also been the former Ambassador of Pakistan to the United States. And currently he is serving as the Director General of the Institute for Strategic Studies, Islamabad. Sir, we would be honored if you could share your views with the audience.
Thank you, Zishan, and thank you, IPRI. No, I just have questions. I don't have views. I heard very interesting presentations, and if you allow me, I'll just ask 3 questions. But first, good to see Michael, Tamanna, Rabia, and Hussain, all of you. I think these were wonderful presentations. I really enjoyed it. Michael, if I could ask you a question on US-China competition, which in my view is the defining feature of today's geopolitics. This presents a particular difficulty for Pakistan because we have relations with both, and we want to have relations with both. How do you see US-China competition unfold under both likely administrations, under Trump and under Biden? What timelines do you see? And do you see this competition turning into a Cold War, and how quickly in both cases? I mean, it's a hypothetical question, but how do you see that under Trump or under Biden administration? The second comment or question I have is for Tamanna, if she can. It's very good to see her again. Tamanna, on Pakistan-India relations have lately become very tense. And especially after the Modi administration has been indulging in conventional adventures against Pakistan below the nuclear overhang, things like surgical strike of last year. We also do see that Modi administration is being encouraged and emboldened by the US tilt towards India. If any such confrontation escalates between India and Pakistan, how do you see Trump administration deal with it? And how do you see Biden administration dealing with it? My third question is to Rabia. Again, wonderful presentation. You suggested revival of Pakistan-US strategic dialogue after the elections. We saw that Donald Trump administration did not have a structured dialogue with Pakistan. Will, in your opinion, Biden administration like to have a structured engagement with Pakistan, the kind of which we saw under Obama administration, where he was the vice president? So just these three questions, and thank you, IPRI and Dr. Wilson, for a wonderful session, very knowledgeable. Thank you.
Should I go ahead and respond to the first question?
Yes, sir, please. Please
Okay,
go ahead.
thank you. Yeah, well, thank you, Ambassador Chaudhry. It's great to see you here. Thank you for those great questions. In terms of the question you asked me, all of those questions were great. In terms of the one you asked me, I myself am not a China expert per se, so I can't weigh in too heavily on the U.S.-China rivalry and the details of it and prognostications and all. But you know, I'll make a few comments in response to your question. One is that, as I said earlier, both a President Trump 2.0 and or a President Biden would view China similarly in a broader lens, and that both would see it as a top strategic competitor, strategic rival. That clearly will not change. As I think Tamara and maybe others said, there's a pretty strong bipartisan support in Washington around this idea of China being the key foreign policy challenge for the United States. That won't change. In terms of a few differences between the two candidates, in terms of how they would look at China and the US-China rivalry, I do think that Biden tends to, or at least in terms of his messaging and comments in recent months, tends to view China more as an economic threat and an economic concern than he does a national security concern or national security threat, as Trump tends to view China from both of those lenses as both an economic and a challenge, security threat. Second, I'm quite confident that if there were to be a President Biden, he would try to use diplomacy more than President Trump has to try to build a stronger global consensus to work together to figure out ways to choose what word you want to say, counterbalance China, push back against it, but not contain. I don't like the word contain, and I know that some think that either Trump or Biden would want to contain China. That's not true at all. I think maybe you could use the word confront with Trump. With Biden, I wouldn't use the word conciliate, but I wouldn't use the word contain either. I think the idea is to push back, counterbalance. I think those are the key words. And finally, another difference between Biden and Trump on China, and I think I had already mentioned this, is that Biden has made clear that he would be very interested in exploring pathways for cooperation between China where they exist. And I had mentioned several before. I think in a foreign affairs essay that Biden had published earlier this year, he laid out his views on China, and he specifically mentioned climate change, interestingly enough, non-proliferation and global health issues. And I think that's a genuine point. I think that a Biden administration would be willing to do that. I just don't know if Trump or a Trump administration would be willing to look at the relationship in that way. One more point on this, the U.S.-China relationship has gotten particularly bad over the last few months, with the pandemic and the rhetoric that the Trump administration has used about China virus and all of that. The rhetoric as well about China stealing American jobs has intensified. A lot of that rhetoric, I think, is there for U.S. domestic purposes. I think that part of that is campaigning, that President Trump believes that he could make an impact and help rally his rank and file if he speaks about China like that. So if Trump were to be reelected, you may see some of that rhetoric be eased just a bit, though not necessarily entirely. So that's basic. So bottom line, to answer your question, I think that both men would see the U.S.-China relationship as a rivalry, as a problem, as a country that would need to be pushed back against. I do see those differences I mentioned before. And finally, I myself don't like the idea of this notion of a U.S.-China Cold War. I don't think we're there yet. I think that the world is a lot different now than it was during the actual Cold War. I don't think it would be simple enough to think that the world is lining up in either the Chinese or the U.S. camp. You have so many countries, including in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific region, that continue to look to China as an economic partner, but may depend on the U.S. or want to depend on the U.S. for security assistance and other things. So it's a pretty nuanced. I think we should look at it in a nuanced way. But thank you for your question.
Thank you, Mr. Kugelman. Ma'am, Ms. Tamanna, Ambassador Azaz also asked you the question, so if you would want to answer that.
Good to see you, Ambassador. It's always wonderful to see you, and have many fond memories of working with you in Pakistan. So thank you so much. I mean, just briefly on the China question, I think Michael, answered very thoroughly, so I don't want to take up a lot of time. I think the question about a U.S.-China Cold War, I agree with him. We're not there. We're not being pushed into that. But I do think perceptions are very important. Perceptions become reality. And I think because of 20 years in Afghanistan, there's this general malaise about South Asia. And I think we can't ignore the institutions, whether it's the Pentagon and the years of military force that have been in Afghanistan, and Congress that is sort of tired of this. And so what can happen is people drift into these these sort of opposing blocks that we don't want. I don't think the US wants it. I don't think Pakistan wants it. But until and unless we can do what Dr. Rabia talked about, which is come up with a positive definition for a US-Pakistan relationship, if you continue to let the strategic neighborhood define it, I think there is a risk of becoming the US, India, China, Pakistan bloc, whether we like it or not. So I think we have to actually actively work to find a basis for positive US-Pakistan relations. And we've done, I will say I sat through strategic dialogue under President Bush. I sat through the strategic dialogue under President Obama. We had, and I think Rabia actually outlined many of the same buckets that we discussed then. Unfortunately, we didn't get anywhere, right? And I think that's the problem. I think that's the frustration both in Washington and in Islamabad. I believe you also asked a question about India's increasing conventional adventurism below the nuclear threshold. I think there's an acknowledgement, definitely by our military leaders of it. I think, what's really interesting is what happened in August 2019. If you put aside the people and the human rights impact of it, I think everyone acknowledges that, and the suffering of the Kashmiris is one part of that. But if you put that aside and only look at it and I think that is a completely separate question from the Islamabad-Delhi competition over this. I think people were this unilateral move in August 2019, it has played very well domestically in India. And surprisingly, there's very little pushback, aside from Pakistan, I think, from major world powers. So India sort of has gotten away with it in some ways. And I think there's an acknowledgement of that in the United States. I think whether I would say a Biden administration probably would be more likely to push back on the human rights aspect of it privately with the Indians. I don't think that would lessen their defense cooperation with the Indians necessarily, but would paint it as, you are a major democratic country, we share democratic ideals. I don't think a Trump administration would care that much about that. Overall, I think there is worry about escalation. What's really interesting is with Balakot and Pulwama, we talk about, I was there, I served in the embassy during the Mumbai attack, and, the Bush administration was very active, and later other administrations very active in trying to de-escalate tensions, right? Calling our close allies in both Islamabad and New Delhi to try to de-escalate tensions. I think what is very interesting is during Pulwama, Balakot, US de-escalation was far less apparent, far less, I think, even effective or even there, right? That this was largely India and Pakistan managing their own de-escalation. While to me that is positive in some ways, that these countries know that they don't want to cross that threshold, I think it's worrying as well. We don't have the same de-escalation mechanisms that we once had, and including between India and China, that, previous de-escalation mechanisms, which we all took for granted, haven't really worked in this latest round. I mean, now they are working, but they haven't worked as they did in the past. So I think there is thinking about what does that look like? I mean, if we're talking about conflict and the largest trigger point, it's between India and Pakistan, these nuclear armed allies of the United States. So, but I don't think that's going to translate either for Trump or Biden into pulling back from defense cooperation with one or the other, or getting involved directly in in terms of mediating the conflict. So even though President Trump might say it offhandedly, in practice, it's not going to mean anything. And I think institutionally, both the Department of State and Department of Defense would be against getting between the two states directly, unless it's crisis management and crisis de-escalation, fine, they'll get involved. But in terms of mediating the conflict, I think the US does not see much benefit for itself. I think it sees it as a very messy problem. And to be honest, I would say over time, we are less and less probably a objective arbiter of that. I mean, would you want us to be the objective arbiter in that debate? So, and that's my very, very frank, I don't think people would admit that in the US, but I mean, I think frankly, you don't necessarily want us there arbitrating.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Rabia, you have the floor.
Assalamu alaikum, Ambassador Azaz Chaudhry. You're very kind to ask the question when it should be us learning from you and your vast experience, in this area of Pak-US relations. You're absolutely right. There has been no structured dialogue, or efforts for it from the US administration under Trump. But if a Biden administration comes, there is hope that the kind of strategic dialogue and the structured manner it was brought about in 2006 in Obama administration, there might be a resurgence of it. And I think Pakistan should work towards that. And I'm sure, Pakistan, people in Pakistani establishment have already charted out a plan as to how to approach it. Back then when, the two countries came together, some of the idea was to allay some of the fears that Pakistan had that it felt isolated, and US approached Pakistan in that manner to engage it in all fronts that I mentioned in my talk. At this point in time, too, if a Biden administration comes in, there is probably a parallel to what the situation was. This time, the world's, both India and US are looking at Pakistan moving more towards the China camp. And in order to, probably in their minds, if they want to engage Pakistan so that it does not completely drift into the China camp, these are the areas that are not entirely security related in which Pakistan should be engaged. There was huge U.S. Pakistan energy cooperation under the Obama administration. There was economic, finance, and trade talks. There was talk on education, science, and technology. So minus, even if we were to say that there is no or little convergence on security issues, now where national interests of both countries align with respect to the region, there are other non-security issues in which dialogue can be taken up. So I think there is absolute scope of both countries engaging and exploring options as to how they can work together. And I'm very positive if a Biden administration comes, and if U.S. withdrawal from the region takes place, I don't think that Pakistan's importance vis-a-vis U.S. political and strategic calculus is going to diminish in the region. And Pakistan, for its part, needs to identify more and more areas in which it can probably, sort some of the fears that U.S. had with respect to Pak-China relationship, with respect to the, stability in Afghanistan, and also other areas. So I will remain optimistic and hold on to this thought that there is room for both countries to work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rabia. We also have with us Ambassador Durrani, who again needs no introduction, but just for the sake of formalities, I will introduce him. He has been the former ambassador of Pakistan to Tehran and has also been the permanent representative of Pakistan to the Economic Cooperation Organization. Ambassador Durrani, if you would have any comments and questions regarding the themes that we have discussed today.
Thank you very much. In fact, it's a very interesting discussion, and really the panelists, they have done a wonderful job in educating us regarding the likely scenario in both cases, whether President Trump returns to power or Mr. Biden, perhaps he wins the elections. I would like to just comment on 3 issues. Which in fact have been discussed by Michael as well as Tamanna and Rabia. First is Pakistan-China strategic partnership, and on that count, I think America has reservations. It's the same situation with Pakistan also, that when India-US strategic partnership has come to fruition, and especially with regard to the BECA agreement, which has been signed just a couple of days ago, and just a week before presidential elections, is quite instructive. And I think that would be something which you should be of matter of concern to Pakistan. United States have objections to CPAC. They have objection to our closeness with China, but without any alternative. What alternative does United States have to offer to Pakistan? What to do? And my second issue is with regard to the peace process in Afghanistan. I think that there's a need to go for the reality check with regard to Afghanistan. Afghanistan still, after even almost 2 decades that the United States is present there, it is still a rent-seeker state. The leadership there, whether it was Karzai or Mr. Ashraf Ghani, what they have to show to perform, what has been their performance with regard to reconciliation process in the country? What have they done? And then the most serious issue, which has never been discussed at the international level, is that Afghanistan has become a narco state. And a narco state cannot guarantee stability in the country. Just look at Colombia, fighting for stability for the past 4 decades. Now, it all happened, especially during the past 2 decades, when the United States was in charge of whole of Afghanistan and the situation there and whatever was produced there. Now, this narcotics is almost a $50 billion business in Europe, and almost $5 billion returned to Afghanistan, of which who is who of Afghanistan benefits, including the Taliban. So this all has happened, and it has in fact promoted the war economy in the country. So I think we have to look at that very seriously. And related to that is, then I think I would also love to hear from our panelists, especially Michael, that what the other NATO nations who have been part of for this coalition in Afghanistan have been doing. Most of those nations have been caveat nations. They never participated in actual operations, except for the United States, Canada, UK, and to some extent Australia. So the rest of it, so they were not blamed for any laxity or something. They were just doing the guard duties. But major brunt has been borne by Pakistan with almost 70,000 people killed, both civilians as well as law enforcement agencies, military, police, and all that. So I think that has not been properly acknowledged, and that needs to be acknowledged. And the most important part is that in Afghanistan, there are many spoilers, internal spoilers and external spoilers. External spoilers, we have been making it publicly that India is a spoiler. And I think United States has shown total, you can say, apathy towards this aspect. India has been using Afghanistan soil through the NDS, their national security, their intelligence agencies. I have served in Afghanistan from 2005 till 9. I have witnessed how the Indians have been operating there. Their aid to Afghanistan is so-called $3 billion aid, and that is close to Pakistan. And in a tribal society, since I also come from the tribal background, in a tribal society, all that has been done is actually, they pump the money through either NDS or through their operatives to those people. And then in the tribal society, this kind of a money cannot be hidden. And this is what has been going on. They have been using that through their Kandahar consulate and through Jalalabad consulate. And that's how this instability is being caused. And then one thing that when we talk about the peace process in Afghanistan, India would not want peace returning to Afghanistan. If that is so, if peace returns to Afghanistan, it means Pakistan will be relieved of the second front. So India would never want a second front to stop in Afghanistan. So I think I would want some comments from our panelists from the United States. And then my last point would be on Indo-US strategic partnership. And that is should be a source of concern in Pakistan, which is there and which has been expressed by Pakistan. So I think there is a need to address those issues. I would again refer this both to our panelists from the United States, Tamanna and Michael Kugelman. Really enjoyed the talk, really quite enlightening, but some of my observations, which could be turned into a question, I would very much appreciate having the responses to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. If any of the speakers would like to answer Ambassador Durrani's questions. Yes, Mr. Kugelman, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be brief because I'm sure others will want to respond as well. On the question of NATO nation contributions in Afghanistan, certainly it's true that the U.S. has been carrying out the brunt of the military operations for quite some time. And it's important to remember that the war in Afghanistan is even more unpopular in European countries than it is in the U.S. And it's been quite unpopular in the U.S. for quite some time as well. But one thing I noticed has been very important and very useful is that Europe, and not just talking about NATO countries here, but talking about Europe on the whole, EU countries have been increasingly active in hosting dialogues, not necessarily formal dialogues, but track 2 dialogues in which efforts are made to bring Afghans, Pakistanis, Indians, Europeans together to talk about reconciliation, best ways forward. So I think that's an important thing to be doing, even if it's on the sidelines. I think that the obstacles to the U.S. Pakistan relationship that have been laid out there, I think those are all that's had to be said has already been said about that. On the U.S. India relationship, on the notion of U.S. India strategic partnership, certainly that is a constraint for the U.S. Pakistan relationship, and as I had said earlier, I think that the mere existence of the relationship is not necessarily a problem for the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, but it's the trajectory it's taken and the deepening security relations between the two countries, something that will continue to happen on bilateral levels. But one thing that I find interesting about this relationship is that it's not as fraught with momentum as some may think in Pakistan. It is fraught with a lot of momentum. But I think there's some very interesting things about this relationship that will still have to be worked out. I mean, for one thing, New Delhi has continued to say that it is not interested in alliance arrangements. It has continued to use the term strategic autonomy to refer to how it wants to view its relationships with countries, including the United States. And so that suggests that the two countries will need to figure out a way to build up a strategic partnership that happens outside of the alliance system that the U.S. tends to prefer to have with its closest allies. So that's interesting, and that'll need to be worked out. So I think that it's sort of useful to have some nuance in terms of how we look at this relationship. And I know that there are some observations that have come from Pakistan that India is essentially doing whatever the Pakistan wants. India is doing whatever the U.S. would like it to do, serving as a junior partner so that they can work together to push back against China. This is not accurate at all. So my point here is that yes, that is a growing relationship, and I can understand why it would be a concern to Pakistan. But that is a relationship that continues to be in progress, and there still are a number of things that will need to be worked out about it. But certainly, it is a relationship that is driven in great part by shared concern about China and its activities in the broader Indo-Pacific region. I think that's undeniable. That will continue to be the case regardless of who wins the election.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kugelman. If anybody else would like to add to that, the comments that Ambassador Rani has just made. Yes, Ma'am Tamanna, please.
Ambassador Durrani, thank you very much for your comments. I would just like to, for a moment, put on my peace process hat and talk a little bit about, some of your comments about Afghanistan and the peace process. I think it is interesting to note the existence of narcotics and rent seeking. I think what you touch upon is a war economy, right? And the comparisons with Colombia are very interesting. We've actually studied the Colombian peace process very closely when working in Afghanistan. I've worked on the Afghan peace process and reconciliation for almost 10 years. And I think one of the comments that Hussein made about the differences in how how the Trump or Obama Biden would approach peace process, I think from the outside, they look very different. But what's really been going on with help of European allies, it's literally been more than 10 years in the making to get to this point. That quiet, secretive conversations facilitated by Pakistan, facilitated by other allies, Europeans, others. You have to build trust. You have to define the parameters of the conversation. It has taken many failures, talking to people who aren't really Taliban, talking to real Taliban. I mean, I was at Murray where Ambassador Chaudhry, hosted us all. There have been so many ups and downs, but all of those are actually part of the longer term peace process. Your comments, I think, highlight a few things. One, when you have a war going on for so long, you actually do build a complete structure system, a war economy where there are winners and losers from the war. And until and unless we look for a transformative peace deal, which is not something you can get very quickly, you have to acknowledge the people who will actually lose from a peace process, right? And those are the people who will be spoilers. There's two types of spoilers. We have external spoilers who will largely use violence. And I think there will be many groups outside of the Taliban who will use violence to stop a peace process. And there are internal spoilers, internal to the Taliban, internal to the Afghan political system, who feel that they will lose out. And those internal spoilers have to be brought into the conversation, and their needs have to also be addressed. I think a peace process is much more complex than we think. It's much more complex than just signing the day you sign. And more than half of peace deals end up in resurgence of violence. And that's what we want to avoid in Afghanistan. And that will take a strong relationship with Pakistan. I think thinking that the day the deal is signed, we're done, the US is done, Pakistan is done, which I think a lot of people wish were true, is not the case. Implementation will be the key factor in whether there's resurgence of violence, whether you can actually have transformative peace for the region, and can you continue to uphold that peace? Can it be sustainable over time? I think that is a huge challenge, and I'm not sure that our political setup is such, whether in the US or in Pakistan, to have such a long-term implementation strategy for any peace process. And obviously you all know the intricacies and the complexities of Afghanistan very well. Those will have to be tended to in the long run, not just in terms of terrorism, but in terms of economic stability, whether it's narcotics or tribal allegiances. All of these things will not just end the day the peace process or the peace deal is signed. One point that Hussein made was, there may be more conditions. I actually think either way you're going to have conditions, whether Biden or Trump, in the sense the Obama-Biden administration, they said the Afghan government has to be at the table initially, right? They did have some quiet outreach to the Taliban without the government, whatever, but they said to actually have substantive conversations, we have to have the Afghan government at the table. Fine. I think the Trump administration was able to make a breakthrough by losing that requirement and saying we will meet with the Taliban directly without the Afghan government. But once we signed our framework agreement in February, now you have to meet with the Afghan government. So the condition may not have been front loaded, but it's on the back end. And that is still proving to be a huge obstacle in getting to actually sustainable peace. I think we have a lot more work to do to see this through.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Now we also have questions from our audience as well. We've been receiving a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we could not include all of them due to the brevity of time, and also because we think that most of these questions have already been answered by our esteemed panelists. But one question by Dr. Khushbu Ejaz, who's also the assistant professor at Kennard College, Lahore, is, do you foresee any shift in the US policy towards Kashmir issue if Biden gets elected as president? So if any of our speakers, particularly from the US, would like to answer this. Oh, sorry, yes, Mr. Kugelman.
Yeah, so I'll be very brief here. The answer is no. I think that the U.S. position on this issue has been consistent for a long time, and I would actually argue that the U.S. position on Kashmir has remained the same even in the Trump era, when I know there's been some commentary about the things that Trump had said. And I know that some observers have indicated that he's offered to mediate in Kashmir. My sense is that he has not really offered to mediate in Kashmir. His most consistent messaging on the issue of Kashmir, to the extent that he's spoken about it, which is very rarely, is that he said that he would be willing to mediate if both sides ask. And we know that the Indian side is not going to ask. So to me, that suggests that it's not really a genuine offer. It's more a way for him to try to, I don't want to say appease both sides, but to give both sides something to claim victory for. For Pakistan, there's a way to say, well, the president is offering to mediate. He's bringing up the issue of Kashmir. And of course, India could say, well, he clearly doesn't mean that to be a genuine offer, given that we're not going to agree to have the U.S. mediate. As I said before, and as others have said before, a Biden administration would likely to be a bit more critical, perhaps publicly, of the situation in Kashmir, particularly if things were to change in a major way, if there were to be some sort of major trigger event, as there was with the India's decision to revoke Article 370. But I wouldn't overstate that criticism. There will be, as so many of us have said many times, there is strong bipartisan support in favor of the U.S. relationship with India, and there will be a desire not to rock the boat, so to speak, by delving into an issue that India would much rather the U.S. or anyone else, for that matter, not really get into.
Thank you, Mr. Kugelman. We also have another question regarding cross-border terrorism, but this is shaped a bit differently. So if any of our speakers from the US would like to answer this. This is asked by Karen Fisher, who would like to know Washington's concern about cross-border terrorism emanating from Pakistan and involving India has been recognized. But will there ever be greater acknowledgement about state-sponsored terrorism by India committed inside Pakistan? That and other destabilizing activities and outside support to subversive dissidents trying to split up Pakistan. So if any of the speakers from the US would like to answer this question.
Well, I could just say very briefly that, to articulate thinking of people in Washington, a lot of these comments and these allegations have not been taken nearly as seriously as those about the opposite of Pakistani terrorists going into India. And I know that these allegations have intensified for sure from the Pakistani side. Now, certainly those that study the region, broadly speaking, in Washington, they're following these things. They're aware of the allegations, and I'll be very honest with you that to the extent that I hear responses from those that are privy to some of these conversations that are held with Pakistanis about these allegations, those that I've talked to suggest to me, well, there doesn't really seem to be convincing and persuasive information as maybe suggested from Pakistan. Now, I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, but I am saying that, I think that given the way the US on bipartisan levels continues to look at India, the focus will be on figuring out ways to cooperate with India, and counterterrorism has always been. We've talked about China as a key area of cooperation for the two sides, but the issue of counterterrorism continues to be a concern. And for when it comes to U.S. interests, when it comes to concerns about terrorism, the big concerns relate to the groups that are perceived to threaten the United States the most. And of course, that had been for quite some time with the Haqqani network and Afghanistan focused groups. And then as well as the India focus groups, LET, JEM, because these are groups that have targeted and killed Americans in the past. I think it's only natural that regardless of which president wins the election, that will continue to remain the case, because at the end of the day, a government is going to look at a particular issue, including terrorism, from the lens of those interests. I think it's only natural.
Mr. Manna, you wanted to add something to this comment?
I agree with Michael's comments. I think the important thing here is the perceptions are very different in Washington and Islamabad about this. I think he's absolutely right. Our first concern is groups, terrorist groups that emanate from the region that threaten U.S. interests and U.S. people, right? So that puts a priority on certain groups over other groups. But secondly, I think even when Pakistan has been very serious about these concerns, U.S. officials have looked into them and have not found or do not perceive the same evidence or data that maybe Pakistani policymakers see it as. So I don't think there's the same threat perception or the same viewpoint on these. So until, and this is another area of, I think, divergence in terms of our understandings.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for question and answer sessions. I would like to really thank the audience and especially our speakers for their patience and for their enlightened comments on the issue. Now, I would like to request our acting president, Brigadier Retired Rashid Wali Janjua, for his closing remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Zishan. A very absorbing and very engaging discourse. Actually, in interstate relations, good intentions would wither on the vine unless undergirded by a strategic congruence of interests. So everything emanates from those strategic interests that both countries embrace. And in this case, I think there are certain divergences that preclude our strategic congruence, and there's a need to go for those strategic congruence of interests before we start reaping the real advantages of whether Trump comes or Biden comes. Now, some of the very important takeaways from this discourse. One was that institutional continuity when it comes to national security of the United States, the institutional continuity is the name of the game. And what is that about national security? The three elements that were identified: Pak-China relationship, nuclear safety, counterterrorism. Now, I would, for one, like to have concentrated on economic linkages and to go to a new paradigm and look for a new era of geoeconomics where economic interdependence defines the relationship between Pakistan and United States instead of the geopolitics of yore. And another important takeaway, I think, from Mr. Kugelman was the need for private channels other than government to government. I think that's a very important point, and there's a great scope in this sphere, and I'm sure we can break new grounds in this aspect. Now, what about the state-sponsored terrorism and the cross-border terrorism? While the concerns of international community and United States about elements affecting the United States operations have been adequately taken care of through Pakistani actions like complete border fencing, better border controls, and joint surveillance and counterterrorism operations. The aspect about Indian state-sponsored terrorism in Balochistan are very, very underplayed aspects. What more evidence do we need when the national security advisor of a country comes on national hookup and says that we are sponsoring the acts of terrorism and destabilization in Pakistan's Balochistan province? I don't think any other evidence is required. And this is an aspect that the United States need to take cognizance of in order to ensure the peace and stability in the region, which was identified by Tamanna Salihdeen in our discourse. I once again thank the distinguished panelists, Mr. Kugelman, Tamanna Salihdeen, Dr. Rabia, Dr. Hussain Nadeem, for a very engaging and absorbing discourse. And I'm sure we'll have many more like this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brigadier Rashid. Now, with this, we would bring an end to today's webinar. I would once again like to thank all of the speakers from the US and Pakistan for this enlightening conversation and making this 2+2 a great success. And I would also like to thank our participants for bearing with us through all the technical glitches. We hope to see you again soon. Take care and Allah Hafiz.